My name is Sasha. I am 34 years old and somehow still healing from the deep wounds my own family inflicted on me. As a successful corporate executive, I built my own empire to escape their toxicity, but I still tried to maintain a sliver of connection. Last Christmas, they invited me to the annual family dinner. I stood on the snowy front porch, holding a beautiful red velvet gift box. My father opened the door, looked me up and down, and smirked. He told me I was ruining the mood and banned me from stepping inside my own childhood home. I simply smiled, handed my mother the gift, and turned to walk away forever. But then my sister's wealthy new boyfriend stepped out of the kitchen, and the look of absolute terror on his face changed my family dynamic permanently. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your true worth. Growing up in the south suburbs of Chicago meant you understood the immense value of keeping up appearances. Our large brick colonial home with its pristine white trim and perfectly shoveled driveway looked like a fortress of warmth and holiday cheer to the outside world. But inside those thick walls, emotional coldness permeated every single corner of our lives. For years, I was the designated family scapegoat. I was the one who could never do anything right, while my older sister Monique was the undisputed golden child. Tonight was supposed to be a peaceful truce. It was Christmas Eve, and the winter air was freezing, biting fiercely at my cheeks as I walked up the long concrete driveway. I wore my tailored wool coat and carried a small red velvet box tight in my hands. Inside that box was a profound gesture of goodwill. It was a peace offering that cost more than both of their cars combined. As I reached the front steps, I could hear the faint, joyful sound of classic holiday music playing from the living room stereo. I could smell the rich, savory scent of baked macaroni and cheese, savory collard greens, and roasted turkey wafting through the tiny cracks of the heavy wooden front door. I took a deep breath, letting the icy Chicago air fill my lungs and calm my racing heart. I told myself this year would finally be different. I was a grown woman now. I was the chief executive officer of a massive private equity firm, though my family had absolutely no idea about my wealth. They still thought I was the same struggling, confused girl who had to beg them for financial help years ago. I rang the brass doorbell. The familiar chime echoed loudly inside the house. Laughter spilled out from the main hallway. I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the entryway. The front door swung open, revealing my father, Calvin. He stood there in his crisp, burgundy holiday sweater, looking down at me with the exact same expression he used when I tracked mud into the house as a little girl. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. He did not step aside to let me out of the freezing cold night. Instead, he placed his large hand firmly on the doorframe, physically blocking my entry into the house. Behind his broad shoulders, I could see the warm, inviting glow of the living room fireplace. I could see my mother Brenda hovering nervously near the hallway table, holding a silver tray of appetizers. "Merry Christmas, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and bright. I held up the red velvet box toward him. "I brought something special for you and Mom tonight." Calvin did not smile. He did not even look at the gift. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh that cut right through the festive holiday music playing softly behind him. "Let us not make this about you tonight, Sasha," he sneered. His voice was low but filled with unmistakable venom. "You always ruin Monique's vibe. She is in a fantastic mood right now. She brought her new boyfriend over to meet the family for the first time, and we absolutely do not need your negative energy dragging everyone down. Just leave the gift on the porch and go home." I stood there in stunned silence as the winter snow began to fall much heavier, landing softly on my dark hair and my wool shoulders. I looked past my father at my mother. Brenda quickly averted her eyes, looking straight down at the marble floor tiles. She would never, ever stand up to him. She would always protect Monique's fragile peace over my basic existence. That was the firmly established rule of this household. I was fully expected to beg or argue or cry on the porch. In the past, I definitely would have. I would have demanded to know why I was being treated like an unwanted stray dog on Christmas Eve. I would have let them see me break. But I was no longer that broken little girl. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or show even a fraction of the emotional hurt that my father so desperately wanted to see. Instead, I smiled. A genuine, calm, confident smile that immediately seemed to confuse him. I reached out and gently pressed the red velvet box into my mother's trembling hands. "Merry Christmas, Mom," I said softly and genuinely. "Enjoy your evening." I turned around gracefully, my leather heels clicking softly against the ice-covered porch. I was fully prepared to walk back to my waiting black luxury sedan and never look back at this house again. I was ready to leave them to their toxic delusions forever. But the universe had a completely different plan for us that cold night. Just as my gloved hand reached the freezing metal of the stair railing, the heavy wooden door to the kitchen swung wide open. A tall white man with sandy blonde hair stepped into the brightly lit hallway, holding a crystal glass of red wine. He was laughing loudly at a joke Monique had just told him. Then his eyes drifted toward the open front door. He saw me standing on the snowy porch. The laughter died in his throat instantly. Before Connor could even process what he was seeing, my Aunt Yvonne's shrill voice pierced through the open kitchen door. She was sitting comfortably in the living room, completely unaware that I could hear every single word she was saying. I could picture her perfectly sitting on my mother's expensive leather sofa, holding a plate of appetizers and looking down her nose at the world. "She still has that same arrogant attitude," Yvonne announced loudly over the holiday music. "Did you see the way she just stood there looking at Calvin? No wonder she cannot keep a man to save her life. Who wants to deal with a woman who always thinks she is smarter than everyone else in the room?" My Uncle Terence chimed in immediately, his deep voice echoing off the hallway walls. He was always Yvonne's faithful echo chamber, agreeing with whatever mean-spirited thought she produced. "You are right about that, Yvonne. That girl always had a massive chip on her shoulder. She thinks she is too good for her own blood. Calvin is exactly right to keep her outside tonight. If you let her in, she would just sit at the dinner table judging everyone and bringing the whole mood down with her endless negativity." I stood on the porch feeling the cold winter wind whipping around my legs and locked eyes with Connor. He looked like he had just seen a ghost materialize on the front steps. His sandy blonde hair was perfectly styled, and he wore a very expensive tailored suit that I instantly recognized, but his face had drained of all human color. He was completely paralyzed in the doorway holding his glass of red wine. He could not move forward and he could not step back. He just kept staring at me, his brain desperately trying to calculate why his terrifying corporate boss, the woman who controlled his entire professional future, was standing on his girlfriend's front porch, in the freezing snow, being insulted by her family. Inside the warm house, the gossip continued to flow as freely as the alcohol. "I am just glad I never gave her a single dime when she came begging to me years ago," Yvonne continued, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction and pride. "Do you remember that Terrence? She had the absolute nerve to ask me for $5,000 to start some ridiculous real estate business. $5,000 I told her to get a real job like a normal person instead of daydreaming about buying commercial buildings. She was so ungrateful and disrespectful when I said no." I remembered that specific day perfectly. I had meticulously drafted a 40-page business plan. I had analyzed the commercial real estate market in downtown Chicago and found a perfectly undervalued property that was ripe for acquisition. I just needed a small bridge loan to cover the final closing costs. Yvonne had laughed right in my face and called my ambitions delusional. What she conveniently forgot to mention to her captive living room audience tonight was what she did the very next week. She had happily written a personal check for $8,000 to Monique so my sister could buy a limited edition designer handbag to impress a guy she was dating at the time. That was the established family dynamic. Funding my sister's vanity and superficial lifestyle was considered a solid investment, but funding my education and my legitimate business ventures was considered a total waste of money. At that exact moment, Monique stepped into the hallway. I could not see her yet, but I could hear her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. Oh, Auntie Vaughn, please stop talking about her, Monique said, her voice dripping with fake exhaustion. You are going to ruin my appetite before we even cut the turkey. Monique stepped into my line of sight, coming up right behind Connor. She was wearing a completely inappropriate emerald green silk dress that looked like it belonged at a summer cocktail party rather than a family Christmas dinner. She had a smug, satisfied smile plastered across her meticulously contoured face. She wrapped her arms around Connor from behind, pressing her cheek against his broad back. Let us talk about happy things tonight. Monique purred loud enough for the whole house to hear. Let us talk about my amazing man standing right here. Did I tell you guys he just got promoted to Director of Risk Management at his firm? He is making more money than anyone in this entire neighborhood combined. We are already looking at buying a house in the north suburbs together, one of the really expensive ones with a gate. Yvonne gasped in exaggerated delight, clapping her hands together. Oh, praise the Lord. Finally, a man who can take proper care of you, Monique. You deserve the absolute best things in life. You have always been the most beautiful and sweetest girl in this entire family. Monique giggled, soaking up the praise like a sponge. Thank you, Auntie Vaughn. Connor is just so incredibly successful, and he treats me like an absolute queen, not like the pathetic losers my sister used to bring around. Honestly, I feel bad for Sasha sometimes. It must be so miserable being her. Always struggling financially, always angry at the world. I stood perfectly still on the icy porch. The snow was gathering heavily on the dark shoulders of my coat. I did not break eye contact with Connor for a single second. He was still staring directly at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and dawning realization. He was listening to the woman he supposedly loved proudly trash-talk her own sister. He was listening to her brag arrogantly about his salary, his promotion, and his prestigious job title. But what Monique did not know, what my father, my aunt, and my mother did not know, was that I was the one who signed Connor's massive paychecks. I was the chief executive officer and sole founder of the private equity firm that had just hired him away from his previous job. I was the one who personally approved his recent lucrative promotion. I owned the entire company he bragged about. Connor's breathing became visibly shallow and erratic. His chest rose and fell in quick, panicked jerks. His eyes darted nervously from my calm face to the red velvet box still resting in my mother's hands and then rapidly back to my face. He felt Monique's arms wrapped tightly around his waist, and he looked completely suffocated by her touch. The confident, successful man who had walked out of the kitchen a minute ago was completely gone. He was replaced by a terrified mid-level employee who had just realized he walked blindly into a career-ending nightmare. Monique, completely oblivious to the massive tension radiating off her boyfriend, squeezed him tighter. "Honey, why are you just standing there in the cold draft?" she asked playfully, her tone sickly sweet. "Shut the door so we can go back to the party and drink our wine." Connor opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. His jaw worked silently, his right hand began to tremble violently. The heavy crystal glass of red wine tilted dangerously in his grip. The dark red liquid sloshed against the delicate edges of the rim. He tried to tighten his fingers around the stem to regain control, but his motor skills completely failed him under the crushing weight of his panic. The glass slipped from his trembling fingers entirely. The sound of the shattering crystal glass was deafening in the sudden quiet of the hallway. The cheerful holiday music playing from the living room stereo suddenly felt entirely out of place. A massive wave of dark red wine splashed aggressively across the polished wood floor, sending a spray of dark droplets right onto the delicate hem of Monique's expensive emerald green silk dress. Monique let out a piercing, dramatic shriek that echoed off the high ceiling. She immediately began complaining loudly about how much the designer dress cost and how Connor was being so incredibly clumsy. She stood there with her hands on her hips, fully expecting him to drop to his knees and apologize to her profusely. She expected him to gently dab at her ruined silk fabric with club soda and beg for her forgiveness, while our parents rushed over to comfort her. That was how the world worked in Monique's mind. She was the absolute center of the universe, and everyone else existed simply to serve her immediate needs. But Connor did not even look at her. He completely ignored the woman he was supposedly planning to buy a gated house with. His panicked, wide eyes remained locked entirely on me. He saw that a few tiny drops of the red wine had splashed onto the toes of my black leather heels. Connor moved faster than I had ever seen him move in our corporate office. He shoved past a stunned Monique, almost knocking her off balance. He scrambled toward the nearby dining table and grabbed a handful of white cloth napkins. Then he threw himself onto the cold, wet hardwood floor right at my feet. The sharp shards of broken crystal crunched audibly beneath his knees, but he did not seem to care or even notice the pain. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He began frantically wiping the tiny drops of wine off my shoes, his hands trembling so violently that he could barely hold the napkins. The entire house fell into a stunned, breathless silence. My father Calvin stood firmly in the doorway, his mouth hanging slightly open in pure shock. His large hands fell limply to his sides. My mother Brenda froze completely with the silver tray of appetizers shaking so hard in her hands that the stuffed mushrooms began to slide off the edge. In the living room, Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence had abruptly stopped their malicious gossiping. They were now craning their necks from the leather couch, their eyes bulging out of their heads as they tried to comprehend the bizarre scene unfolding in the entryway. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. For my entire life, my parents had treated me like the dirt beneath their shoes. They had actively banned me from the house on holidays, they had constantly mocked my ambitions, and they only ever tolerated my presence when it suited their narrative of being a generous Christian family. I was the family scapegoat, the child they were all deeply ashamed of. Yet here was a highly educated, wealthy white man, a powerful director of risk management, who made hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, kneeling in spilled wine and broken glass, physically scrubbing the shoes of the woman they all despised. It was a complete inversion of everything they believed to be true about the world. Here was a man my parents desperately wanted to impress, a man they saw as my sister's ultimate prize, bowing at my feet like a terrified subordinate. He knew exactly who I was. At Apex Holdings, I was not the quiet younger sister who took verbal abuse from her family. I was the sole founder and chief executive officer of a private equity firm that managed hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial real estate assets. Connor had only been at my company for 3 months, but he had already witnessed me dismantle entire corporate boards and fire a senior vice president without batting a single eyelash. He knew my reputation for being completely ruthless and demanding absolute excellence. And now he had just shattered a glass of red wine at my feet, while his girlfriend's family openly humiliated me. In his mind, his lucrative career was already over. "Ms. Washington, I am so incredibly sorry," Connor stammered, his voice shaking uncontrollably as he kept his head bowed. "Please forgive me. I did not see you standing there. I am so sorry about your shoes. I will pay to replace them immediately. Please let me clean this up, boss." The word boss hung heavily in the tense air of the hallway like a physical object. It echoed in the total silence. Calvin blinked rapidly, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. He looked from the kneeling, trembling man in the expensive tailored suit to my calm, unbothered face. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently and so suddenly that none of them could process the reality of what they were witnessing. My mother let out a small, confused gasp. I did not step back. I did not tell Connor to get up. I simply looked down at him, allowing the heavy silence to stretch out for a few more agonizing seconds. It was a calculated corporate move to establish absolute dominance in a room full of people who had just spent the last 20 minutes tearing down my character. Monique stared down at her boyfriend, her perfectly contoured face twisting into an ugly mix of anger and sheer bewilderment. She looked at the dark red stain ruining her expensive silk dress, and then looked down at Connor, who was still desperately wiping my black leather shoes. Her brain simply refused to accept the information playing out right in front of her eyes. She let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded harsh and brittle in the quiet house. She reached down and grabbed Connor by the shoulder of his suit jacket, trying to forcefully pull him up from the wet floor. "You are confused, babe," Monique said dismissively, waving her manicured hand in the air as if she could simply brush away the reality of the situation. "Get up from the floor right now. You are embarrassing yourself in front of my parents. That is not your boss. That is just my useless, younger sister." Connor slowly pushed himself up from the wet hardwood floor, his expensive suit pants completely ruined by the dark red wine and the tiny shards of broken crystal. He did not look at Monique with the same loving admiration and blind affection he had shown her just 10 minutes ago in the kitchen. Instead, he looked at her like she was completely out of her mind. He straightened his posture, brushing the dirt from his knees, and his entire demeanor shifted right before our eyes. He transformed from a terrified subordinate caught in a massive corporate blunder into a rational man who had just realized he was dating a pathological liar. "Do not ever speak about her like that again," Connor said, his voice dropping into a hard, authoritative tone that made Monique physically recoil in shock. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about." Monique let out a loud, offended gasp, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to rest against her chest. She looked at my parents, fully expecting my father to immediately jump to her defense and reprimand Connor for daring to raise his voice at her in their family home. But Calvin remained completely silent, his eyes darting nervously between Connor and me. Connor reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. His fingers were still trembling slightly from the adrenaline as he unlocked the screen and opened his web browser. The hallway was dead silent, except for the faint sound of holiday music from the living room and the sound of his thumb rapidly tapping against the glass screen. He navigated to a specific web page, waiting a brief second for the high-resolution images to load, and then he aggressively shoved the phone right into Monique's face. "Read it," Connor demanded, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings of the entryway. "Read exactly what it says on the screen right now, Monique." Monique blinked rapidly, her heavy fake eyelashes fluttering as she tried to focus on the glowing rectangular screen. She let out a confused and dismissive breath. "It is just some stupid, boring business article," she muttered, trying to physically push his hand away from her face. "It is the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for the city of Chicago," Connor corrected her, his tone incredibly sharp and completely devoid of any previous warmth. "Look at the featured photograph right at the top of the page. Look at the name printed in bold letters right underneath it." My mother, Brenda, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the small digital text from a distance. Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence had completely abandoned the living room by now and were creeping into the hallway to get a better look at the drama unfolding. "That is Sasha," Monique whispered, her voice suddenly sounding very small and completely devoid of its usual arrogant confidence. She stared at the professional photograph of me, wearing a tailored gray power suit, standing in a sleek, modern office. "Why is her picture on this prestigious website? This has to be some kind of sick joke or a scam she paid for." Connor let out a bitter laugh that sounded almost entirely hollow. He pulled the phone back and quickly navigated away from the web browser to a different secure application. He opened the private corporate web portal for Apex Holdings. He rapidly typed in his employee credentials, clicked on the executive leadership directory, and turned the screen around so the entire family could see it clearly. My professional headshot was displayed prominently at the very top of the massive organizational chart. Right below my name in crisp, clear letters was my official corporate title, Chief Executive Officer and Founder. "She is not a useless younger sister," Connor said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty and deeply ingrained respect. "Sasha Washington is the sole founder of a private equity firm that controls hundreds of millions of dollars in commercial real estate assets across the entire Midwest. She is the brilliant woman who personally approved my executive hiring last month. She signs my massive paychecks, Monique. She sits at the absolute top of the corporate food chain while you are out here playing pretend." The heavy silence that followed his words was so intense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the entire house. Uncle Terence let out a low, extended whistle of pure disbelief. Aunt Yvonne covered her mouth with both of her hands, her eyes wide with absolute, utter shock. The niece she had just mocked mercilessly for being poor and single was actually a self-made multimillionaire who possessed more wealth than their entire extended family combined. But Connor was not finished tearing down the illusions. He looked directly into Monique's eyes and delivered the final crushing blow to her fragile, fabricated reality. "And do you want to know the absolute best part of all of this?" Connor asked, his voice dripping with a newfound profound disgust. "Last week I was reviewing the risk assessment files for our latest major corporate acquisition. Apex Holdings just finalized the massive purchase of the commercial retail plaza on the west side of the city. The exact same building where you rent that overpriced tiny retail space for your little day spa." Monique physically stumbled backward, as if she had just been struck violently in the chest by an invisible force. Her mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no words came out. "That is right." Connor continued, relentlessly refusing to give her a single inch of mercy. "The exact same spa that you have been constantly complaining about for months. The struggling business you told me is barely making enough money to cover its own monthly utility bills. Sasha does not just run the massive company I work for. As of last Tuesday morning, she is legally your new commercial landlord." The sheer magnitude of the shocking revelation hit the family like a runaway freight train crashing through the front door. All the lies, all the subtle psychological gaslighting, and all the financial manipulation they had used to keep me firmly positioned at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. I was no longer the helpless, pathetic scapegoat they could bully and discard for their own twisted amusement. I held the entire legal deed to Monique's failing business right in the palm of my hand. Monique looked completely, fundamentally destroyed. Her beautiful emerald green dress was heavily stained with dark wine. Her wealthy, successful boyfriend was looking at her with absolute total revulsion, and her entire false narrative of superiority was suddenly exposed to the entire family as a complete, pathetic sham. She slowly looked over at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization that I held the ultimate power to evict her failing business and ruin her life with a single quick phone call to my legal team. I maintained my calm, perfectly neutral expression. I did not gloat, and I did not smile triumphantly. I just stood there quietly on the snowy porch, letting the freezing winter wind blow past me as the ultimate, undeniable truth finally settled over the deeply toxic household. I slowly shifted my calm gaze from my shattered older sister to my parents standing in the doorway. I expected my father to be absolutely furious. I expected Calvin to start yelling at the top of his lungs and demanding that I leave his property immediately for intentionally humiliating his favorite daughter on a holiday. I expected my mother Brenda to start crying hysterically and begging me not to hurt her precious golden child. But that is not what happened at all. Calvin stood perfectly still, his broad, heavy shoulders tense under his holiday sweater. He looked at the glowing screen of Connor's smartphone, and then he slowly looked back at me standing in the cold. The deep anger and blatant disdain that had violently contorted his face just moments ago completely melted away like ice on a hot stove. Brenda's face underwent the exact same chilling psychological transformation. The harsh, bitter lines of irritation around her mouth suddenly softened into something deeply, deeply unnatural. Their familiar facial expressions froze completely for a split second, and then morphed instantly from deep, arrogant disdain into a look of purely calculated financial greed. My mother Brenda was the first one to break the eerie, heavy silence. She stepped forward onto the freezing, snowy porch, completely ignoring the bitter winter wind that was actively blowing into the hallway. The silver tray of appetizers was quickly shoved onto the entryway console table. She reached out and grabbed my arm with both of her hands, her grip surprisingly tight and desperate. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant daughter," Brenda cooed, her voice suddenly dripping with a sickeningly sweet fake warmth that made my stomach physically churn. "Why are you standing out here in the freezing cold? Come inside right now. Take off your heavy coat and sit down at the dinner table with your family." She tugged at my sleeve, pulling me across the threshold and into the warm, brightly lit hallway, as if the previous 10 minutes had never even happened. There was absolutely no apology for trying to ban me from the house on a holiday. There was no remorse for the cruel things they had all just said about me. In Brenda's mind, the sudden shocking revelation of my massive corporate wealth acted as a magical psychological eraser, completely wiping away decades of horrific emotional abuse and blatant neglect. She looked at me not with a mother's genuine pride or love, but with the frantic, calculating eyes of a desperate woman who had just realized she was standing next to a winning multi-million-dollar lottery ticket. I let her pull me into the dining room, my black leather heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor, right past the massive dark red wine stain that Connor had just been frantically trying to clean. Connor was still standing rigidly against the hallway wall, looking completely nauseous and terrified to even breathe in my direction. Monique was trailing silently behind us, her face pale and her expensive silk dress ruined, looking exactly like a spoiled, entitled child who had just been violently informed that the world did not actually revolve around her. The atmosphere in the dining room had shifted so drastically, it felt like walking directly into an alternate dimension. Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence, who had just been loudly mocking my entire existence and my relationship status from the living room sofa, were now standing right by the dining table with wide, eager smiles plastered across their faces. Yvonne rushed forward and hastily pulled out a heavy carved oak dining chair for me at the center of the table. "Sit right here, sweetheart," Yvonne insisted, her voice trembling with a disgusting amount of forced affection. "Let me get you a fresh hot plate of food. You must be absolutely starving and exhausted after running such a massive, important company all day." I did not sit down. I remained standing right behind the heavy oak chair, resting my gloved hands casually on the carved wooden backrest. I looked around the lavishly decorated room, taking in the pathetic sight of the people who shared my blood, but had never once shared their love or support. This was the exact toxic financial entitlement that infected so many dysfunctional families, especially ours. When you are struggling and trying to build a foundation from nothing, they treat you like an absolute burden. They call you arrogant for dreaming big, and they slam the door right in your face when you ask for the absolute smallest amount of emotional or financial support. I thought about the years I spent eating cheap noodles in a freezing tiny apartment while they posted pictures of their lavish family vacations online. I thought about the times I called home crying because my electricity was shut off, and Calvin told me it was a good character-building lesson in personal responsibility. But the very second you become incredibly successful, despite all of their constant sabotage, the rules of personal responsibility are instantly thrown out the window. They suddenly develop a severe, convenient case of amnesia. Your hard-earned money suddenly becomes family money. Your vast resources become their divine birthright. You stop being the family scapegoat and instantly transform into the family bank account. The successful Black woman is always expected to carry the heavy financial weight of the entire extended family without ever asking for a simple thank you or an apology. We are expected to be the mule, the endless provider, the silent workhorse who fixes everyone else's terrible life choices. My father, Calvin, walked slowly into the dining room and took his usual seat at the absolute head of the long table. He did not look embarrassed or ashamed of his previous behavior. The initial shock on his face had completely vanished and was quickly replaced by a thick layer of unearned, arrogant authority. He picked up a heavy silver butter knife and tapped it sharply against his crystal water glass. The sharp ringing sound commanded the immediate attention of everyone in the room. Calvin cleared his throat, puffing out his chest under his burgundy holiday sweater. He looked at me not as a daughter he had deeply wronged, but as a highly lucrative asset he now intended to fully manage and control. "Good," Calvin announced, his deep voice booming across the dining table, echoing off the walls. "If you are really the boss of that massive company, then this changes things completely. This is actually a massive financial blessing for this family. We are going to handle this situation right now, like adults." He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the white lace tablecloth, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that he had literally just tried to banish me into the snow 5 minutes ago. First thing tomorrow morning, you are going to call your human resources department and double Connor's salary, Calvin ordered, waving his hand dismissively, as if he were simply ordering a side dish at a cheap restaurant. He is practically your brother-in-law, and he deserves to be compensated properly for dealing with the high-level corporate stress of your company. Second, you are going to wire $50,000 directly into Monique's checking account by the end of the week. Her new spa business is going through a rough patch, and her credit cards are completely maxed out right now. Brenda nodded eagerly from the other side of the table, her eyes shining with absolute, unfiltered greed. Yes, exactly, Brenda chimed in enthusiastically. Family takes care of family, Sasha. You are incredibly rich now, and you do not even have a husband or children to spend all that money on. It is only right that you help your sister get back on her feet so she can plan her future with Connor. Calvin slammed his heavy hand flat against the table to finalize his ruling. You are wealthy now, Sasha, so you need to step up and do your duty to us. He demanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. We keep the money in the family. That is exactly how this works. You owe us that much for everything we have done for you. I looked at the greedy, expectant faces surrounding the dining table. I looked at my father acting like a king demanding a massive financial tribute from a peasant. I looked at my mother nodding along happily to his blatant extortion. I looked at Monique, who had suddenly stopped crying and was now staring at me with a renewed sense of arrogant entitlement, fully expecting me to pay off her massive debts simply because we shared the same last name. They were all waiting quietly for me to pull out my checkbook and buy my way into their conditional fake affection. I stared directly into my father's eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but freezing cold, utter indifference. And I gave him my final answer. I am not giving any of you a single goddamn cent. The heavy silence returned to the dining room, but this time it was thick with a sudden violent tension. Calvin's face turned a deep, mottled shade of purple. He gripped the edge of the dining table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp, as if I had just physically slapped her across the face. How dare you speak to me like that in my own house? Calvin roared, his voice shaking the delicate crystal glasses on the table. After everything we have done to raise you and put a roof over your head, you are going to sit here and hoard your millions while your own sister struggles to survive? You are a selfish, ungrateful little brat, and you always have been. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I just looked at him with the exact same cold, analytical stare I used during hostile corporate takeovers. I decided it was finally time to strip away all the emotional manipulation and break this family dynamic down into cold, hard, undeniable math. Let us talk about being selfish, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly level and calm. Let us talk about family investments. Do you remember exactly 5 years ago when Monique decided she wanted to be a high-end fashion influencer? She convinced you to liquidate exactly $200,000 from your retirement fund so she could open that pathetic luxury clothing boutique downtown. The one that went completely bankrupt in less than 8 months because she spent all the inventory money on lavish trips to Miami and designer shoes for herself. Calvin opened his mouth to shout, but I immediately cut him off, slicing through his anger with pure, ruthless logic. Did you ever see a single penny of that $200,000 returned to your bank account? I asked, staring him down. No, you did not. And when I came to you exactly 2 months later begging for a simple $500 loan just so I could buy my required textbooks for my college business classes, what did you tell me? You told me that I was a drain on the family finances and that I needed to learn how to pull myself up by my own bootstraps. Brenda tried to interject, waving her hands frantically across the table. Now, Sasha, you know we were very tight on cash back then because of your sister's business struggles. It is not fair to bring up the past right now. I turned my deadpan stare directly onto my mother. It is entirely fair to bring up the past when you are trying to extort my present, I told her. While you were eagerly funding Monique's endless delusions of grandeur, I was working 3 separate waitressing jobs just to keep my electricity turned on. I worked the early morning shift at a greasy diner, the afternoon shift at a local coffee shop, and the night shift at a cheap sports bar. I slept 3 hours a night on a dirty mattress on the floor, while you guys bought Monique a brand new car because she was feeling depressed about her failed boutique. I looked back at Calvin, refusing to let him look away from the ugly financial truth. So tell me, Dad, I asked, my voice echoing loudly off the dining room walls. Where exactly was this beautiful concept of keeping the money in the family when I was starving and working myself to the absolute bone? Why is it that family duty only ever applies to my bank account and never to hers? The numbers simply do not add up. You did not invest in me, you completely abandoned me, so you have absolutely no right to demand a return on an investment you never made. Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence shifted very uncomfortably in their heavy oak seats, entirely unable to argue with the brutal financial reality I had just laid out on the table. The room was completely stripped of its usual comforting illusions. I had taken their favorite narrative of the ungrateful younger daughter and completely destroyed it using their own terrible financial history. Connor was still standing near the hallway archway, listening to every single word. He looked physically sick to his stomach. He was a highly paid director of risk management. His entire corporate career was based on analyzing bad investments and identifying massive financial liabilities. Hearing that my father had drained $200,000 from a retirement fund for a business that failed in 8 months made him look at my parents like they were completely financially illiterate. He looked at Monique like she was a massive walking liability. Monique saw the look of utter disgust on Connor's face, and it absolutely terrified her. She knew the harsh financial truth was the one thing that could permanently break her relationship with him. She could not let him believe that she was a financial parasite who drained her own parents dry and expected her younger sister to bail her out. She realized instantly that she was rapidly losing her tight grip on the room. She could not argue with the math. She could not deny that she had squandered hundreds of thousands of dollars while I built a multi-million-dollar empire entirely from scratch. Her false, carefully curated image as the successful, beautiful business owner was lying dead on the dining room floor next to the shattered wine glass. She slammed both of her hands down on the dining table, making the expensive silverware rattle loudly. Tears began to well up in her eyes, perfectly on cue. So she did the only thing a true narcissist knows how to do when they are backed tightly into a corner by the undeniable truth. She violently shifted the narrative and decided to play the ultimate victim. Monique pushed her heavy dining chair back violently, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. She stood up so fast that her crystal water glass wobbled dangerously before tipping over completely and spilling cold water across the pristine white lace tablecloth. She ignored the spreading mess entirely, her eyes fixed aggressively on me, with a level of pure, unhinged hatred I had never seen from her before. "You are such a massive, pathetic liar, Sasha," Monique screamed, her voice cracking with forced dramatic emotion. "You expect everyone in this room to believe that you just magically built a multi-million-dollar company all by yourself? You have no real connections and no real talent. The only way a miserable girl like you could ever get that much money is if you were running some kind of massive illegal scam or sleeping your way straight to the top of the corporate ladder." Aunt Yvonne let out a loud, scandalized gasp, her hand fluttering nervously up to her chest. "Oh my goodness, Monique, that is a terrible thing to say." Yvonne whispered loudly, but her eyes were gleaming with sick fascination. She was absolutely loving every single second of the drama. I did not raise my voice in response. I just let her wild accusations hang heavily in the air, highlighting exactly how incredibly desperate and pathetic she sounded. When you are dealing with a classic narcissist who is rapidly losing their carefully constructed false reality, they will always resort to the most aggressive and disgusting personal attacks they can think of. They cannot handle being exposed as a failure, so they try to drag you down into the mud with them. "I am not a liar, Monique," I replied calmly, my voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "The financial records are completely public. My corporate acquisitions are fully documented, and my tax returns are filed perfectly every single year." I did not have to sleep with anyone or steal anything to build my success. I actually had to work for it. I know hard work is a completely foreign concept to you since you have spent your entire adult life treating our parents like a personal, unlimited ATM machine. Monique let out a furious, shrill cry. She spun around wildly and marched over to where Connor was still standing rigidly near the hallway archway. She reached out and grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deeply into his expensive suit jacket. Are you just going to stand there and let her disrespect me like this, Connor? Monique demanded, shaking his arm aggressively. Defend me right now. Tell them she is a lying, manipulative snake. Tell them you make more money than she does and that she is just a low-level employee at your massive company. Tell them the truth right now. Connor looked down at her hands gripping his jacket and then slowly looked up at her contorted, furious face. The profound illusion that Monique had spent the last 6 months carefully building for him was completely shattered beyond repair. He had believed she was an independent-driven, wealthy business owner who came from a respectable, affluent family. Instead, he was staring at a spoiled, deeply entitled financial parasite who was actively throwing a massive toddler tantrum because she could not extort $50,000 from her younger sister to pay off her massive credit card debts. Connor gently but very firmly grabbed her wrists and physically removed her hands from his suit jacket. He took a deliberate step backward, putting immediate physical distance between them. Sasha is not lying, Monique, Connor said, his voice low and incredibly strained. She is the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. She owns the entire private equity firm. She is my boss. And honestly, right now, I am deeply embarrassed to even be standing in the same room as you. Monique stumbled backward, as if he had just struck her across the face. Her mouth fell completely open, and her breathing became shallow and erratic. She looked frantically around the dining room, desperately searching for anyone to validate her rapidly crumbling false reality. She looked at my mother Brenda, who was now staring down at her plate of food, completely refusing to make eye contact with anyone. She looked at Uncle Terence, who was suddenly deeply interested in examining the intricate pattern on the wallpaper. Her entire world was collapsing, and she had absolutely nobody to blame but herself. Her long-established manipulative, gaslighting nature, the exact same toxic behavior she had used to control and abuse me for our entire lives, was finally fully exposed under the bright, harsh lights of the dining room for her new wealthy boyfriend to see. But there was still one person left in the room who would always violently defend her delusions, no matter how incredibly toxic or mathematically impossible they were. There was still one person who would rather burn the entire family to the ground than admit his perfect golden child was actually a massive failure. My father Calvin abruptly pushed his heavy chair back and stood up to his full imposing height. He slammed both of his large fists down onto the dining table with such explosive force that the heavy silverware jumped and rattled loudly against the plates. The sudden violent noise echoed sharply through the tense room, silencing everyone instantly. "You listen to me right now, you arrogant little girl," Calvin spat, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl that used to terrify me when I was a child. "You think because you have a fancy title and a big bank account that you can just waltz into my house and disrespect your own flesh and blood. You think you are completely untouchable now." He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with exertion. "I know exactly how these massive corporate companies work, Sasha. They care about their public image more than anything else. They care about morals and ethics and community standing. How do you think your wealthy investors and your elite board of directors are going to react when your own father shows up in the main lobby of your pristine corporate headquarters holding a protest sign? How will they feel when I tell them that the brilliant chief executive officer they trusted with their millions is actually a cruel, heartless monster who leaves her own sister to drown in absolute poverty?" Brenda gasped, but quickly nodded in agreement, finding her courage now that her husband had taken firm control of the room. "That is right, Calvin," she whispered loudly. "You tell her. And it will not just be your corporate office," Calvin continued, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. "I will go straight to Pastor Thomas at the First Baptist Church tomorrow morning. I will get on the church Facebook group tonight, and I will write a massive public post detailing exactly how abusive and ungrateful you are. I will tell the entire congregation that you turned your back on the loving family that raised you in the church. I will tell all the church elders that you are financially starving your parents while you sit up high in your luxury penthouse. You know exactly how fast gossip spreads in our community, Sasha. By Sunday morning, you will be an absolute pariah. Your professional reputation in this city will be completely dragged through the mud and destroyed. Aunt Yvonne chimed in from the corner, her voice trembling with fake righteous indignation. Your father is absolutely right, Sasha. A good Christian woman does not abandon her family when she is blessed with financial abundance. What would the Lord think of your incredible selfishness tonight? You should be deeply ashamed of yourself. This was his ultimate weapon. For my entire life, my parents had used the strict moral authority of the Black church and the heavy pressure of the local community to keep me completely in line. Whenever I tried to speak up about the blatant unfairness in our house, they would threaten to tell the pastor that I was a rebellious, sinful child. They cared more about maintaining their flawless Christian image to the neighbors than they ever cared about my actual well-being. It was incredibly sickening how quickly they could twist religion to justify their own blatant financial extortion. The church was never a place of spiritual sanctuary for me. It was a social courtroom where my parents constantly put me on trial to ensure I remained obedient. They were perfectly willing to weaponize their faith and their community standing to extort me for cash right in front of a complete stranger. Calvin reached into the inner pocket of his sweater and pulled out a folded piece of paper, slamming it down onto the dining table right next to the spilled water. "This is a commercial loan application," he demanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "It is for a $100,000 line of credit to save Monique's business and consolidate her personal credit card debts. Since you refuse to just give her the cash outright, you are going to co-sign this loan right here, right now. Your massive corporate income and your perfect credit score will guarantee the immediate approval. You are going to sign on the dotted line tonight, Sasha, or I swear to God I will make it my personal mission to ruin your perfect little empire by tomorrow morning." Monique wiped her fake tears and looked up at me with a smug, triumphant smirk creeping back onto her face. She honestly believed her daddy had just saved the day again. She believed that the heavy threat of public humiliation and professional ruin would be enough to force me back into my designated role as the obedient, submissive financial mule for the family. She thought I would crumble just like I always did when I was a frightened teenager. Connor watched the entire extortion attempt unfold with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He was actively watching a father blackmail his own successful daughter, using the church and corporate sabotage as leverage just to fund his other daughter's shopping addiction. It was a level of extreme psychological toxicity that his rational brain could barely process. He took another step away from Monique, looking at the entire family like they were covered in a highly contagious disease. The heavy silence descended on the dining room once again. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for me to break. They were waiting for me to look down at the floor, apologize for my temporary rebellion, and reach into my designer purse for a pen to sign away my hard-earned credit score. They fully expected the old terrified Sasha to resurface under the crushing weight of their collective emotional blackmail. I looked down at the folded loan application resting on the wet white lace tablecloth. I looked up at my father's red, furious face. I looked at my mother's eager, greedy eyes and my sister's smug, entitled smirk. I looked at Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence waiting eagerly for my total submission. And then something inside me completely snapped. But it was not a break of submission or fear. It was a massive, overwhelming release of tension that had been building inside my chest for the last 2 decades. I threw my head back and I started to laugh. It was not a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle. It was a loud, genuine, chilling laugh that erupted from the very bottom of my chest and echoed terrifyingly loud against the high ceilings of the dining room, making my father physically flinch. My laughter finally subsided, leaving the dining room in a state of absolute chilling silence. I wiped a single tear of pure amusement from the corner of my eye and looked directly at my father, who was still standing there, holding his ridiculous commercial loan application. "You want to go to the church?" I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly calm whisper that carried across the room. You want to stand in front of Pastor Thomas and the entire congregation tomorrow morning and tell them about our family finances. I think that is a fantastic idea, Dad. You should absolutely do that. Calvin frowned, his thick brows pulling together in deep confusion. He had fully expected me to beg him to keep my name out of the church gossip circles. He did not expect me to eagerly encourage his threat. But when you stand up at that podium, I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the dining table. Make sure you tell the congregation the complete truth. Make sure you explain to all the church elders exactly why you are so desperate for me to co-sign a $100,000 loan tonight. Make sure you tell them that you and Mom are not actually struggling because of inflation or the economy like you have been crying about for months. Tell them the real reason you are completely broke. Brenda let out a sharp, terrified squeak. Calvin, Sasha, please, she begged, her face suddenly turning an ashen shade of gray. Let us just keep family business inside the family. There is no need to bring this up right now. No, Mom, I said sharply, cutting her off. Dad wanted to make this public, so we are going to make it public. I turned to look at Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence, who were watching the exchange with wide, eager eyes. You guys remember last summer, right? I asked them. You remember when Monique came over for the 4th of July barbecue, driving that brand new white Porsche Cayenne? She told everyone she bought it herself because her luxury spa was doing so incredibly well. And do you remember when she spent the entire month of August posting hundreds of pictures on social media from her luxury vacation in Paris, wearing thousands of dollars worth of designer clothes? Aunt Yvonne nodded slowly, her eyes darting nervously between me and Monique. Yes, I remember, Yvonne said, her voice filled with sudden creeping suspicion. We were all so proud of her for being so successful and independent. She is not successful, Aunt Yvonne. I revealed, my voice ringing with cold, hard truth. She is a complete fraud. Her spa has been operating at a massive loss for over a year. She did not buy that Porsche and she did not pay for that Paris vacation. My parents paid for all of it. Uncle Terence scoffed, waving his large hand dismissively. That is impossible, he said. Calvin and Brenda do not have that kind of cash lying around. Calvin retired 3 years ago and his pension barely covers their medical bills. They did not have the cash. I agreed, maintaining eye contact with my uncle. So they did the absolute most reckless and stupid thing a person can do. 14 months ago, my father secretly went to a predatory lending company and took out a $400,000 second mortgage on this exact house. The collective gasp from Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terence was so loud it sucked all the oxygen out of the dining room. This was not just any house. This was the ancestral family home that had been passed down from my grandparents. It was a sacred piece of generational wealth. It was supposed to be completely paid off, a secure legacy for the entire family. The undeniable fact that Calvin had secretly mortgaged it to fund Monique's superficial lifestyle was a massive, unforgivable betrayal to the entire extended family. You did what? Uncle Terence yelled, jumping up from his heavy oak chair. His face was contorted with pure, genuine rage. The veins in his neck were bulging against his collar. Calvin, tell me she is lying right now. Tell me you did not put a second mortgage on our parents' house so this spoiled little brat could drive a luxury car. Calvin opened his mouth, but he could not find a single word to defend himself. His silence was the only confirmation Terence needed. Aunt Yvonne clutched her chest, looking at my mother with absolute, utter disgust. You two have lost your damn minds, Yvonne screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Brenda. You put the family home at risk for a trip to Paris, and now you have the absolute audacity to sit here and demand that Sasha bail you out because you cannot afford the monthly payments. The united front the family had maintained against me for my entire life completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. They were no longer allied against the family scapegoat. They were actively turning on each other, ripping each other apart like wild animals over the sickening financial truth. The pristine Christian family image they loved to project to the neighborhood was officially dead and buried. Monique was backed against the dining room wall, her face pale and her eyes wide with sheer panic. Her perfect illusion was entirely destroyed. Everyone in the room now knew that she was nothing but a massive financial parasite sucking her parents dry to maintain a fake wealthy image. Connor stood near the archway, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the dysfunction unfolding before him. He was a numbers guy, a director of risk management who spent his days analyzing terrible financial decisions. He rapidly calculated the financial reality playing out in front of him. A $400,000 second mortgage at a predatory interest rate meant my parents were bleeding cash every single month just to cover the minimum payments. It meant they were financially drowning and facing absolute ruin, all so their precious golden child could pretend to be rich to her friends. He slowly turned his head and looked directly at Monique. His eyes traveled down from her ruined emerald green silk dress to the chair resting right next to her. Sitting casually on the dining room chair was the brand new black quilted Chanel handbag she had eagerly shown off to him just yesterday. She had specifically told him she bought it as a well-deserved reward for closing a massive corporate client at her spa. Connor stared at the expensive designer bag. He knew exactly how much that specific piece cost. He knew that bag was purchased with money stolen from a retired couple's home, equity money extorted through severe emotional blackmail money that was currently destroying an entire family legacy. A look of absolute visceral disgust washed over his face as he stared at the horrible woman he had once mistakenly loved. Connor took a slow, heavy step into the center of the dining room, completely ignoring my father, who was still holding that ridiculous loan application. He did not look angry in the traditional sense. He looked completely hollowed out, like a man who had just woken up from a very long and very expensive nightmare. He looked right at the black quilted Chanel handbag sitting on the chair, and then he looked directly into Monique's panicked eyes. "You told me you were a business heiress," Connor said, his voice eerily calm and flat in the tense room. "You looked me dead in the eye on our first date and told me that you came from a long line of successful real estate developers. You said your luxury spa was generating so much revenue that you were thinking about expanding to a second location in the Gold Coast neighborhood. You told me that bag was a gift to yourself for hitting your quarterly profit margins early." Monique swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. "Connor, please, let us just go outside and talk about this in private," she pleaded, reaching out her hand toward him. "My sister is just trying to start drama because she is jealous of what we have. She is making all of this up to ruin my life and sabotage our beautiful relationship." Connor slapped her hand away so fast it made a sharp cracking sound. "Do not touch me," he growled, stepping back. "Do not even try to spin this into another one of your pathetic lies. Your own uncle just confirmed the second mortgage. Your father just tried to blackmail your sister into signing a commercial loan to bail you out. There is no massive profit margin, Monique. There is no real estate empire. You are a complete fraud living off money that your parents literally stole from their own retirement and their own house." Aunt Yvonne and Uncle Terrence watched the confrontation in stunned silence. The entire family was finally witnessing the complete and total disintegration of Monique's carefully crafted facade. She was not the independent, wealthy woman they had all bragged about to the church congregation. She was a manipulative parasite, and her wealthy boyfriend was currently stripping her bare in front of everyone. Brenda tried to intervene, her maternal instinct to protect her golden child overriding her common sense. "Now, Connor, you have to understand that starting a business is very hard," Brenda stuttered nervously, gripping the edge of the dining table. "Monique is just going through a temporary rough patch right now. The economy is terrible, but she is a very smart girl, and she will turn it around soon. You two love each other, and that is what really matters." Connor let out a harsh, humorless laugh that sounded more like a bark. "A temporary rough patch," he repeated, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Is that what you call it, Brenda? Is that what you call manipulating your elderly parents into risking their entire ancestral home so your daughter can play dress up and pretend to be rich on the internet? You people are absolutely delusional. I have worked in risk management for my entire adult life, and I have never seen a family so financially destructive and morally bankrupt." He turned his attention back to Monique, his eyes narrowing into cold slits of pure contempt. And to think I actually felt sorry for you last week, Connor said, his voice dripping with venom. When you came crying to my apartment saying your corporate bank account was temporarily frozen due to a clerical error, I actually believed you. I thought you were just a stressed-out business owner dealing with bad banking bureaucracy. Monique's face instantly drained of whatever little color it had left. She took a frantic step back, bumping into the dining room wall. Connor, stop, she whispered, her eyes darting toward me and then back to him in pure terror. Please do not say another word in front of them. But Connor was not going to protect her dirty secrets anymore. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out his leather wallet. His hands were perfectly steady now, driven by a cold, calculating anger. He opened the wallet, pulled out a sleek platinum credit card, and threw it onto the dining table. The plastic card landed right next to Calvin's folded loan application with a sharp clatter. You told me you needed to borrow my card to cover your employee payroll for a few days, Connor announced to the entire room, refusing to let her hide. You swore to me that the funds would clear by Monday and you would pay me back immediately. You looked me right in the face and cried real tears. But my accounting department flagged the card yesterday morning. You did not use that money to pay any employees, Monique. You swiped my personal credit card for $15,000 at a luxury jewelry boutique downtown and another $3,000 at a designer shoe store. You literally stole from me to fund your fake lifestyle. The dining room erupted into absolute chaos. Uncle Terence threw his hands in the air, muttering a string of angry curses under his breath. Aunt Yvonne covered her face with her hands, shaking her head in profound disgust. Calvin and Brenda stood completely frozen, unable to comprehend that their perfect angel was not just a terrible business owner, but an actual petty thief who was actively stealing from the man she claimed to love. I stood silently by my chair, watching the entire toxic foundation of my family collapse in real time. Monique had spent her entire life stealing from everyone around her. She stole our parents' attention, she stole their retirement funds, she stole the equity in our family home, and now she had stolen $18,000 from the man she was trying to trap into a marriage. Her entitlement knew absolutely no bounds, and her greed had finally